Everyone has a breaking point. How modern battlefields are a breeding ground for psychological breakdown. We'll investigate mental health issues in the modern military. I'm Martin Stanford. This is Insight. Welcome to Insight. There is no such thing as Rambo, no soldier who can face the stress of battle and appear to be invulnerable. That's what a court here in Britain heard in the case of a Royal Marine who shot dead an injured insurgent in Afghanistan. Sergeant Alexander Blackman had his murder conviction overturned after the UK's top court heard evidence he was suffering from the trauma of war. The case highlighted high levels of mental health issues among troops serving in modern war zones. Insight senior correspondent Dana Lewis reports.
10 years after the initial invasion of Afghanistan, this is September 2011. These British troops are involved in a daily, grinding, seesaw war.
Approximately 200 meters.
Just trying to hold territory taken from the Taliban, who stubbornly fight on. Bases are in danger of being overrun. The Royal Marines on 6-month tours are carrying out frightening patrols where they are hit by ambushes and roadside bombs. It's 50 degrees hot, extremely dangerous, and they just want to go home.
It's absolutely unspeakably hot. I was sweltering.
Chris Terrell is a documentary maker who was in Helmand province and paints a grim picture of what troops routinely under fire are experiencing.
It was physically extremely demanding, but also emotionally, psychologically demanding as well, because the threat was always there. And, of course, the place not only was crawling with insurgents, it was seeded with IEDs, improvised explosive devices. So they called it IED Central. And going on patrol, they called it Afghan roulette. Every step you thought could be your last. Now that plays havoc with your mind.
On September 15th, Sergeant Alexander Blackman is leading 4-2 Commando on a foot patrol which comes under fire. An Apache gunship is called in for support, and a Taliban fighter is left badly wounded.
I think he's dead.
What happens next is dramatically captured on a soldier's helmet cam, which Blackman doesn't know is recording.
I'll shuffle off his mortal coil.
Blackman not only shoots the wounded Taliban, but clearly understands by executing a wounded man, no longer posing a risk to soldiers, he's committed a crime.
Nothing you would do to us.
Yeah, roger, mate.
I've just broken Geneva Convention.
Yeah, roger.
Fast forward to March 2017. Blackman, who has been in prison convicted of murder, receives a lesser sentence of manslaughter. A high-profile campaign for his release, and an appeal has won him an early release. His lawyer, Jonathan Goldberg, on why Blackman was found to have diminished responsibility for his crime.
The evidence of 3 psychiatrists was to be believed, namely that when he shot, he was suffering from an adjustment disorder brought on by the intolerable pressures of combat in Afghanistan, and therefore he was not in full control of his mind when he did it.
But all those soldiers face the same combat stress. What's different about Blackman? Well, the court heard the Marine's father had died 2 weeks before the incident. Blackman, who had completed 5 tours of Iraq and Afghanistan, was on his last month of the Afghan deployment and seemed to break. Mental health professor Neil Greenberg, who examined Blackman and then testified on his behalf, described his condition as adjustment disorder.
It's different to post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not PTSD. And these are usually short-term disorders that come on as a result of a particular stressful event or stressful set of circumstances. And as a result of a single event, people develop a set of symptoms, psychological symptoms, intense distress, that impairs their ability to function well and causes them to not be the same person they were before they developed the condition. And in a legal sense, substantially impaired his ability to form a rational judgment and to exercise self-control.
It's a pretty sorry episode in every respect, and I think it's a great example of that old adage that difficult cases make bad law.
London lawyer Patrick Hennessy was a British captain who commanded troops and fought in Afghanistan, and says clearly a crime was committed in this case. We asked him if a soldier appears to be suffering combat stress, what should happen? How do you identify somebody that maybe you think shouldn't be squeezing a trigger, or maybe trigger happy, or somebody that is suffering from traumatic syndrome?
Yeah, I think it's a really good and a really difficult question, and it shows that in the modern battlefield our platoon commanders and our platoon sergeants have to be amateur psychiatrists as well as everything else. I was very lucky. I went through a good program of training and we did serials on identifying those members of our units who would be suffering that.
How many other cases are there like Blackman's which never came to light because there were no helmet cameras? Most units ban cameras on patrol. And consider this. If soldiers call for medevacs to evacuate casualties, they have to guard the landing zone, staying in dangerous territory even longer. Was Blackman under additional pressure not to transport wounded Taliban?
Certainly it's been suggested to me that there was implied tasking that day, that the worst thing that could happen, the worst option, and in war there's only ever a choice between bad and worse. The worst option was to bring in a helicopter or an evacuating personnel carrier into an area which it was pretty certain it would have been shot out of the sky or blown up by an IED.
We are overjoyed at the judge's decision to significantly reduce Al's sentence such that he can be released imminently.
While Blackman's family and many soldiers feel justice was done in this case, there are biting questions about why, if Blackman was suffering combat stress, didn't anyone pick up on it? What about the next soldier who may be experiencing adjustment disorder?
We absolutely know in UK and US forces that a tangible proportion of the force who is exposed to those sorts of threats will develop mental health problems. Most people won't, but absolutely, some absolutely will. And so the question for any military force is they know that people are going to become stress casualties, absolutely going to happen. The question is what you do to mitigate that risk. So ordinarily you have people come and chat to them. You have more senior people come and make sure that they're behaving in a way that would be expected. You give them an avenue of someone to talk to who is of a similar rank that they can talk to freely without fearing stigma. None of that happened in Blackman's case.
Colonel Richard Kemp was a British commander in Afghanistan who criticizes his own force on how it handled Blackman's prosecution with no regard for his mental state when he pulled the trigger.
He was cast out by the military establishment here in the UK, and in some cases we had senior officers and even politicians who were almost grateful for the fact that he'd been convicted of murder and were sort of accepting it as being something that should have happened. I knew, and other people like me knew, it was completely wrong. The reality is, what he did was not murder. The psychological stresses he was under caused him to act in the way he did, as the court ultimately found. But it was very worrying, I think, to find that many people in the military hierarchy here and the political hierarchy were prepared to chuck him into the bin.
Mental health problems from combat stress affect 1 in 4 soldiers. And of course, most are not diagnosed in the heat of battle or while they're deployed. Combat Veterans Associations say some aren't diagnosed for 20 to 30 years later. And just in general, recognition of mental health problems from ex-soldiers is painfully slow.
You know, for me personally, the way that he's been treated disgusts me.
Gary Curtis is a former Royal Marine who served in conflicts including Northern Ireland, author of a book called Incoming. He says he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder after he attempted suicide 2 years ago, years after leaving the military.
I bled out in the shower and lost consciousness. I came round God knows how long later on.
Curtis has just come back from Mosul, Iraq, where he guarded reporters and dramatically saved the lives of some civilians fleeing the fighting. He says if soldiers find it hard dealing with combat stress and mental health issues in the military, it's even worse once they leave. In or out of uniform, it's hard to ask for help.
There's an allergy to asking for help and admitting that you have a problem, especially when it comes to mental health, whether you're deployed or whether you're home again.
Yeah, I mean, it's pride. It's how do you go from being one of just a few thousand people in the world and giving your all and being on the front lines and doing what we do and like the brotherhood, and how do you go from that to not being worth anything. The times change a little bit, and stress and post-traumatic stress and that is not frowned upon so much now. But of course it's tough.
There's hardly enough being done for ex-soldiers fighting post-traumatic stress disorder, while Army commanders claim they're doing everything to help those still in uniform cope with mental health.
They should say it is inevitable that we know that some people will develop mental health problems. It's going to happen. It always does. So the question is, where's our mitigation measure? How do we make sure that command look after each other? Where's the peer support? Where's the chaplains? Where's all these different bits so that they put in place as much as can be reasonably done? You can't prevent these things to stop these terrible things happening. And also, I do think, you know, Blackman also bears some of the responsibility himself. He was a sergeant. He was in charge.
Sergeant Blackman's case raises serious questions. Is it all just action, with little talk to soldiers struggling with combat stress? I'm Dana Lewis, reporting for Insight.
This is Insight. Coming up, we'll speak to former Marine Sergeant Robert Driscoll, who served in Afghanistan at the same time as Alexander Blackman.